Thousands of corpses littered roads. Others were drowned by being tied together back to back. It was butchery that transcended the meaning of massacre, an obscenity. Between 800,000 and 1 million people were killed in the Armenian Bloodbath. Many of them marched into the desert to starve. Those who could not keep up were shot. The Armenians fought back through underground resistance movements, but it was not enough to overcome Ottoman ruthlessness. How did years of discrimination against the Armenians result in one of the worst atrocities in history? Christian Armenians were the longtime inhabitants of the great mountain plateau of eastern Anatolia. The mountains offered their inhabitants fertile valleys and river basins, abundant deposits of iron and gold, a key trade route for European civilizations in Europe, and natural defenses against invading armies. It's no surprise that it became a melting pot of various cultures and ethnicities, housing the Armenians, the Kurds, and eventually the Turks. Unfortunately, whoever was the ruling power at the time would never share the mountain's resources equally with its other inhabitants. The Bagratuni dynasty of the 9th century ruled over the Kingdom of Armenia, but soon they'd fall to the expanded incursions of Turkish-speaking peoples like the Seljuk Turks, who established the Seljuk Sultanate and absorbed the Armenian dynasties. They'd be in turn conquered by the Mongols for much of the 13th century, and so will the mountains change hands until the Ottoman Empire came to be after conquering the Byzantine Empire in 1453. By the time of the 15th and 16th centuries, the once prideful Armenian dynasties were now under the Ottoman banner. In Ottoman society, the Armenians were considered Zimmis. The Zimmi system protects non-Muslim people of the book, which meant Christians, Jews, and sometimes Zoroastrians within an Islamic state. While this meant the Christian Armenians were protected by the Ottoman Empire, they were also subordinate to them and often manipulated through additional taxes and restrictions on land ownership. They had limited political participation and were subject to periodic attacks that ended up in massive butchery. While the genocide was the worst of these, there had been many other carnages throughout the years, which we'll examine later. Zimmis were still granted a high level of social and administrative economy, and allowing them to retain a sturdy sense of communal identity. As the Ottoman economy grew, so did its minority populations. 400 years passed and there were still around 2.5 million Armenians living within the Ottoman Empire by the 19th century. They kept to themselves in homogeneous villages or towns, never a majority in any Ottoman territory they inhabited. Their skill as artisans, merchants, and entrepreneurs was widely renowned, to the point that Mehmed the Conqueror invited Armenian artisans and intellectuals to Istanbul, then Constantinople, after the conquest of the city in 1453. This led to an unfortunate case of tall poppy syndrome. The Armenians had important roles in banking, crafts, and other economic sectors, leading Turkish majorities within the empire to resent them. They would be seen as competitors and economic threats. On top of that, life for the average Armenian within the Ottoman Empire was harsh. Both the Armenians and the Kurds could compete for scarce land, water, and grazing pastures, often leading to conflict and tensions. In areas where the Ottoman Empire's central government was limited, Kurdish tribes would raid Armenian neighborhoods or extort them for protection fees. If a Muslim committed any sort of crime, such as theft of livestock against an Armenian, the local courts and judges would bend over backward to find a way to favor the Muslim. Eventually, Ottoman rulers like Sultan Abdülmecid recognized the bountiful contributions of the Armenians to their society and introduced the Tanzimat reforms in 1839 as part of his Edict of Gülhane. It included provisions to improve the rights and protections of non-Muslim subjects, including Armenians. This would only end up badly in the long term, as we'll discover. Armenian groups within the empire also grew in power, giving rise to the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or the ARF, also known as the Dashnak Susyun in 1890. Their growing power base and the reforms benefiting Armenians led ultranationalist Turks to believe the Armenian elite would eventually betray them. In 1894, Armenians in the Sassoon region refused to pay a tax, causing Kurdish tribesmen and Ottoman troops to eliminate thousands of them on the pretext of treachery. Later, Ottoman authorities suppressed an Armenian demonstration in Istanbul, erupting into more carnage. These were known as the Hamidian massacres, carried out between 1894 and 1896, where hundreds of thousands of Armenians were eliminated and many more were displaced. Another 20,000 Armenians were dispatched in urban riots in Adana in 1909. One could say that even before the greatest of all bloodbaths, the murder of Armenians had become frequent due to extreme paranoia. Eventually, a group of Ottoman revolutionaries known as the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, came to power in 1908 after the Young Turkish Revolution. As part of the Young Turk movement, these revolutionaries restored the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 and established a second constitutional era in the Ottoman Empire. They even promoted equality among Ottoman citizens regardless of their religion or ethnicity. Despite the history of discrimination and intolerance, hope for the Armenians seemed to loom over the horizon. The CUP would give more rights and respect to the Armenians, right? Except that this time, external pressures from other European powers put the Ottoman Empire in dire straits. The Habsburg Empire in modern-day Austria, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire pressed them with their better technology and organization. The CUP became increasingly authoritarian and centralist in its approach, and it once again tore itself apart. A coup within the CUP, if you may, led to the rise of a more militaristic faction. The three pashas, namely Mehmed Talat Pasha, Ismail Enver Pasha, and Ahmed Cemal Pasha. They were a textbook example of how nationalist ideologies dominated the early 20th century, discriminating against minorities. Their incompetence led to the Ottoman Empire's defeat in the First Balkan War from 1912 to 1913, losing almost all of their remaining territory in Europe, and for the first time, the once blooming Ottoman Empire was torn apart from within due to internal struggles. The loss of territories mismanaged over 3 continents led to other religious groups like Jews and Muslims to mass migrate to Istanbul. A disintegrating empire, corrupt politicians, and ethnic tensions were a boiling pot for disaster, leading to growing Turkish hostility towards the Armenians. That, added to the recent bloodbaths, led fearful Armenians to seek support from European powers within the Armenian diaspora, like Russia, France, the British Empire, and Germany. Their goal was to establish a separate Armenian homeland in historic Armenian territories, to have their rights recognized and guaranteed protection against the atrocities committed against them. Once the 3 pashas discovered these negotiations, they saw the perfect opportunity to justify their outdated military technologies and internal corruption, which were the real causes of their defeat in the war. What better scapegoat than the conspiring Armenians, already disliked simply for not being Turks? As World War I loomed closer, the Young Turks joined the Central Powers Germany and Austro-Hungary against the Triple Entente of France, Great Britain, and Russia. Both Russians and Ottomans attempted to recruit Christian Armenians as part of their campaigns. This would pit Armenian Russians against Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. Seeing this as an opportunity, the Young Turks pleaded with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, by now the leading Armenian political party, to fight for the Ottoman Empire and even convince the Armenian Russians to fight with them. The Armenian Russians declined due to their own loyalties being within Russia, but the three pashas blamed this on the Armenian community as a whole. The fact that they expected Armenian Russian citizens to join their cause, considering their known history of atrocities towards their own Armenians, is only further proof of their incompetence. In January 1915, the Ottoman Empire suffered its worst defeat in World War I, defeated by the Russians at the Battle of Sarikamish. This was the final nail in the coffin for the Young Turks, and what led Minister of War Enver Pasha to publicly blame the defeat on the Armenians, kickstarting the greatest of all bloodbaths. On the fateful day of April 21, 1950, Turkish authorities ordered Armenians in the city of Van to hand over their arms. If they did so, they'd be defenseless and easily dispatched, and if they did not, the Ottoman forces would accuse them of treachery. The Armenians braced themselves for the attacks, and by the end of June, only a dozen Armenians out of 100,000 survived. Talat Pasha, Minister of Interior, also banned all Armenian political organizations and ordered their deportations. Those living in the war zones were eliminated, and those in urban areas were forcibly mobilized into the unforgiving desert, with some walking as far as 1,000 kilometers in the summer heat, without food or water. As a rule of thumb, wherever Armenian numbers exceeded 5 to 10%, they'd be destroyed, as to prevent them from preserving their culture. Some were given a choice of converting to Islam to avoid deportation or worse. Even false conversions to survive elimination were tracked, for Talat Pasha kept tabs on all converted Armenians until the end of the war. The conversion process involved eradicating Armenian names, language, and culture. Women had to be married immediately to a Muslim, with many girls appropriated as servants or prisoners for pleasure. Boys were forced into labor for Muslims, many of them forcibly seized or given up by their parents to save their lives. Talat Pasha orchestrated an Armenian decapitation strike by directly targeting the Armenian intellectuals. By dispatching the Armenian leaders, they lowered their chances to strategize and fight back. Around 235 to 270 Armenian intellectuals, including writer and politician Krikor Sorab, poet Daniel Varujan, and educator Rupen Zatarian, among many others, were arrested. The Ottoman Empire passed the Tesir Law on 29 May 1915, prompting the relocation of the detainees within the Ottoman Empire, with their final fates being their demise. Only 80 of these intellectuals survived. Most able-bodied Armenian men had been conscripted into the army, including boys over the age of 12. Before being eliminated, they'd be separated from the deportees. Their remains would be thrown over rugged terrain, lakes, wells, and cisterns. Often, military convoys would stop at deportation camp and ask for a ransom. Those who could not pay were butchered on the spot. As a response, some Armenians created underground networks, hosting secret routes and safe houses to spirit them away from the borders to escape the Ottoman Empire. While the Ottoman Empire prevented journalists and photographers from documenting the bloodbath by threatening them with arrest or worse, this didn't stop pictures from quickly circulating in Western newspapers. The Triple Entente condemned the Ottoman Empire for crimes against humanity, threatening to hold the perpetrators accountable. By 1917, the state-sponsored liquidations of Armenians had ceased. Those smaller-scale bloodbaths and starvation policies remained for years. Talat Pasha was covertly dispatched in 1921 as part of Operation Nemesis, a secret operation of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation to eliminate the masterminds of the Armenian bloodbath. Many of these perpetrators were hailed as martyrs of the national cause by the newly founded Turkish state. While the present Turkish government understands that atrocities took place during the Armenian bloodbath, they deny the guilt of racial extermination, as supposedly no official policy of mass elimination was implemented against the Armenian people. Regardless, the consequences for the Armenian people and for the world were absolutely catastrophic. To add insult to the injury, the Republic of Turkey, the agreed-upon successor state of the Ottoman Empire, continued all internationally wrongful acts against the Armenian people. More bloodbaths, more confiscated lands, and zero reparation. As a way to enforce punishment for the crime of the Armenian mass eliminations, the allies of World War I came up with the Peace Treaty of Severus, involving a commitment for the Ottoman Empire to offer restitution to the Allied nationals and Armenians. 1.5 million casualties, Armenians losing their wealth and property and having nearly non-existent reparations for one of the worst crimes ever committed against humanity. Are there surviving masterminds or participants of the event? Not really, but their descendants and justifications still live on. The centennial of this tragedy was marked on April 24, 2015. With hundreds of demonstrations requesting the Turkish government to recognize it as what it was, racial exterminations. Countless eyewitnesses, government documents, and even the acknowledgement by many other countries like Canada, France, the Netherlands, and others have done nothing to sway the Turkish government's see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil attitude. However, a notable minority of Turkish writers and human rights advocates have acknowledged the Armenian bloodbath as such, and in protest called the Turkish government to recognize their past. Turkish-American historian Taner Akam has labeled this movement as the other Turkey. Will they recognize their acts and make the proper amendments in the future? One can only hope, for the damage has already been done to the Armenian people.